Hey everyone, and welcome back to Trending Tidbits. Today, we're going to be looking at a topic that's both fascinating and I think a little bit taboo, the psychology of sexual fantasies. And to do that, we're going to be looking at excerpts from the book Arousal, The Secret Logic of Sexual Fantasies by Michael J. Bader.
Oh, yeah.
And let me tell you, this book is a real eye-opener. It's really like peeking behind the curtain of our deepest desires.
It's amazing. We all think we know about the subject,
Yeah.
but when you really dig into the psychology behind it, it's a whole different ball game.
Exactly. And one of the things that really struck me was this idea that our fantasies aren't just random desires that like pop into our heads. They're actually carefully constructed by our unconscious minds to create a feeling of safety.
Right. And that safety is crucial because it allows us to explore those desires without being overwhelmed by,
Yeah.
guilt, shame, anxiety. It's like our minds are creating a safe space where we can really let go.
So for someone listening who might be thinking like, wait, my fantasies are supposed to be about feeling safe,
Yeah.
how would you explain that connection?
Well, think about it this way. If you're constantly worried about what your partner might think, or feeling guilty about your own desires, it's going to be pretty hard to relax and enjoy yourself.
Right. Fantasies can help us to bypass those inhibitions by creating a scenario where those anxieties are neutralized.
That makes total sense. And Bader illustrates this point with some really compelling case studies in the book. One that comes to mind is the story of Jan, who needs a fantasy of aggressive domination to reach orgasm.
Oh, that's a great example. Because on the surface, it might seem shocking or even concerning, but when you understand the psychology behind it, it becomes clear that this fantasy is actually helping her overcome her own guilt about her strength and her desire. It's not about wanting to be hurt. It's about creating a scenario where she doesn't have to worry about hurting her partner.
So it's almost like the fantasy is giving her permission to embrace those aspects of herself that she might otherwise suppress. Exactly. And that's one of the key takeaways here. Understanding why a fantasy is arousing is more important than the specific content of the fantasy itself. We're not here to judge. We're here to understand the underlying psychological needs that are being met.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about fantasies. So if safety is the foundation, what are some of the other common psychological factors that shape these desires?
Well, guilt plays a huge role, as we've seen with Jan, but it's not just like general guilt. It can be very specific anxieties, often stemming from childhood experiences that manifest in our fantasies.
You know, when you say childhood experiences, it makes me wonder, are we talking about recreating specific events from our past? Or is it more about the emotional patterns that we learned early on?
That's a great question. And Bader actually addresses this directly. He argues that it's not so much about recreating specific events, but rather about recreating those underlying emotional dynamics. Those patterns of relating that we learned in our earliest relationships, particularly with our parents, can have a profound impact on how we approach intimacy and desire as adults.
Okay, so let's say someone had a parent who was really critical or controlling. Could that lead them to create fantasies where they're the ones in control, calling the shots?
That's a perfect example. It's like our unconscious minds are trying to work through those unresolved issues from our past, trying to create a scenario where we feel empowered and in control, rather than feeling criticized or stifled. And this ties into the concept of pathogenic beliefs, which are these deeply held, often irrational beliefs that we develop about ourselves and the world, often as a result of those early experiences.
So these beliefs are like these hidden scripts that are running in the background, shaping our thoughts, feelings, and even our desires.
Precisely. And they can have a huge GE impact on our ability to experience arousal and pleasure. For example, if you have a pathogenic belief that you're not worthy of love, or that sex is dirty or shameful, it's going to be really hard to let go and enjoy yourself no matter how much you desire your partner.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. So in a way, our fantasies are like a way of bypassing those negative beliefs, at least temporarily, so we can experience pleasure without feeling overwhelmed by guilt, shame, or anxiety.
You're getting it. And Bader provides some incredible real-life examples of how this all plays out. One that stands out is the case of Manny, who uses S&M scenarios in his fantasies to cope with the guilt stemming from his mother's death and his abusive father.
Okay, help me connect the dots here. How does S&M tie back to those childhood experiences?
Well, think about it. Manny's childhood was filled with lost pain and a complete lack of control. His fantasies allow him to create a scenario where he has a sense of control, even if it's within the context of pain or submission. It's not about enjoying the pain itself. It's about reclaiming a sense of agency in a situation where he felt completely powerless as a child.
That's a really powerful insight. It makes you realize that even the most seemingly extreme fantasies can often be traced back to these deeply personal, often painful experiences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to approach this topic with empathy and understanding. We're not here to judge or pathologize anyone's fantasies. We're here to explore the rich tapestry of human desire and understand the complex psychological factors that shape who we are and what we crave.
I'm loving this, like we're peeling back the layers of the onion,
Mm.
revealing this hidden world of meaning and motivation. And speaking of hidden worlds, I'm really curious to see how Bader addresses the whole question of gender differences in sexual fantasies. I know this can be a bit of a minefield, but I'm hoping we can navigate it with sensitivity and nuance.
Of course. And Bader does explore some common trends in how men and women tend to construct their fantasies. But before we jump into that, it's crucial to acknowledge that there are variations and exceptions to every rule. We're talking about general tendencies, not hard and fast rules.
Yeah.
Um, right. So with that being said,
Okay.
let's dive into those gender differences.
Yeah.
What are some of the patterns that Bader highlights in the book?
Well, he suggests that men often gravitate towards more visual, fast-paced fantasies, um, with a focus on specific acts or body parts. He links this back to those developmental challenges boys face in separating from their mothers and establishing clear boundaries.
That's really interesting.
So it's almost like those fantasies are a way of reinforcing that sense of separation and autonomy.
Exactly. It's like their unconscious minds are saying, I am my own person, separate from my mother, and I have my own desires. And on the flip side, women often prefer more relationship-focused, slower-paced fantasies, with an emphasis on emotional connection and intimacy.
Okay, so I can see how that might tie back to those anxieties about abandonment and social vulnerability that we were talking about earlier.
Right. And those anxieties can be heightened for women in a society that still places a lot of pressure on them to be nurturing, accommodating, and emotionally available. So their fantasies often reflect a desire for a deep, secure connection, where they feel loved, desired, and protected.
This is starting to make a lot of sense, and the book has all these intriguing examples that really bring these ideas to life. Do any specific ones come to mind?
One that I found particularly thought-provoking was what Bader calls the good wife problem. He describes how women often suppress their own desires in order to be seen as good wives and mothers, which can lead to men feeling overly responsible and inhibited, perpetuating a cycle of sexual frustration for both partners.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where women are afraid to express their true desires and men are afraid to be too assertive, and everyone ends up feeling stifled and unfulfilled.
Precisely. And this speaks to the power of understanding the psychology behind our fantasies. Because if we can start to recognize those patterns, those unconscious scripts that are driving our behavior, we can start to challenge them and create more authentic, fulfilling relationships.
You know, another point that Bader brings up is how power dynamics often play out in fantasies, with women frequently seeking to seduce powerful figures. What's your take on that?
It's a fascinating observation. And I think it speaks to the complex ways in which our fantasies can reflect our social and cultural conditioning. In a society where women often hold less power than men, it's not surprising that their fantasies might involve reclaiming a sense of agency through seduction or even submission to a powerful figure.
It's like they're flipping the script,
Yeah.
taking control of the narrative in a way that they might not feel able to do in their everyday lives.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these fantasies aren't necessarily about literal power dynamics. It's more about exploring different aspects of the self, different ways of relating to desire and intimacy.
This is all so fascinating. I feel like I'm seeing fantasies in a whole new light. But you know, there's one big elephant in the room that we haven't addressed yet. The impact of technology on all of this. I mean, with the rise of cybersex and online pornography, the whole landscape of sexual fantasy has changed dramatically. How does Bader address this in the book?
That's a great point. And Bader doesn't shy away from exploring these complexities. He delves into how cybersex introduces new layers to the interplay between fantasy and reality, providing both opportunities and potential pitfalls.
So on the one hand, it's easier than ever to access and explore our fantasies, but on the other hand, there's a risk of blurring the lines between fantasy and reality.
Exactly. One of the key benefits of cybersex is the anonymity it provides. It can be a safe space to explore desires that we might feel uncomfortable revealing in real life, to experiment with different identities, and to connect with others who share our interests.
I can see how that would be liberating for people who feel shy or inhibited in their offline lives.
Absolutely. But the downside is that this anonymity can also lead to a disconnect from genuine intimacy. It's easy to get caught up in the fantasy world and lose sight of the importance of real-life connection and vulnerability.
That's a really important point. And I imagine that the ease of access and the instant gratification that the online world provides can also be problematic for some people.
You're right. Bader talks about the potential for addiction with cybersex, particularly for people struggling with feelings of loneliness or disconnectedness. It's easy to get caught in a cycle of escaping into fantasy, which can actually exacerbate those feelings of isolation in the long run.
This has given me a lot to think about. So for someone listening who's maybe struggling with some of these issues, what advice would you give them?
Well, first and foremost, it's important to remember that you're not alone. Many people struggle with finding a healthy balance between fantasy and reality. Especially in the digital age, if you're feeling overwhelmed or out of control, there are resources available to help.
That's great advice. And I think it's important to emphasize that there's nothing inherently wrong with exploring our fantasies, whether online or offline. It's when those fantasies start to control us or interfere with our real-life relationships that we need to pay attention and seek support if needed.
I completely agree. And I think the key takeaway here is that understanding the psychology behind our fantasies can be incredibly empowering. It can help us make more conscious choices about how we explore our desires, how we manage our online behavior, and how we cultivate healthy, fulfilling relationships in our real lives.
Wow, this has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about myself
Yeah.
and about the complex ways in which our minds work. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to get your final thoughts on what we can all take away from this exploration of sexual fantasies.
Well, for me, the most important takeaway is that our fantasies are not something to be ashamed of or afraid of. They're a natural part of the human experience,
Mhm.
and they can actually be a source of great insight and self-discovery.
I love that. It's like we're reclaiming the power of our fantasies, using them as a tool for growth and understanding, rather than something to be hidden or suppressed.
Exactly. And I would encourage everyone listening to approach their own fantasies with a sense of curiosity and compassion. Ask yourself, what are these fantasies telling me about my needs, my desires, my fears? The answers might surprise you.
So as we wrap up this episode of Trending Tidbits, I feel like the main takeaway here is that fantasies are a lot more complex and meaningful than we often give them credit for.
Absolutely. And I think the key is to shift our perspective from judgment to understanding. Instead of getting caught up in the what, let's focus on the why. What are our fantasies trying to tell us about our deepest needs, fears, and desires?
Right, and I think that's where the real power of this knowledge lies.
Right.
By understanding the logic of our fantasies, we can start to challenge those limiting beliefs, those anxieties that might be holding us back from experiencing genuine pleasure and intimacy in our real lives.
Exactly. It's like we're taking back control of our fantasies, using them as a tool for self-discovery and growth, rather than something to be ashamed of or afraid of.
And you know what else I found really empowering about this whole conversation? It's the reminder that we're not alone in this. We all have fantasies, and those fantasies are shaped by a complex interplay of personal experiences, cultural influences, and psychological factors.
Absolutely. There's no such thing as a normal fantasy. What matters is that we find what works for us, what helps us feel safe, empowered, and fulfilled.
So for someone listening who's maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this Trending Tidbits episode?
I would say be kind to yourself and be curious about your own inner world. Your fantasies are not a sign of weakness or deviance. They're a window into your deepest self. And by exploring those fantasies with compassion and understanding, you can unlock a whole new level of self-awareness and personal growth.
That's a beautiful message to end on. And if anyone wants to dive deeper into this fascinating topic, we highly recommend checking out Michael J. Bader's book, Arousal, The Secret Logic of Sexual Fantasies.
It's a real game changer.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of Trending Tidbits. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those trending tidbits swirling.